The crisp, thin air of the Colorado mountains usually hummed with a silence so profound it felt ancient, a balm to Cole Maddox's weary soul. For years, this sacred quiet had been his only trusted companion, a steadfast guardian against the echoes of a past he desperately sought to outrun. But today, that cherished tranquility was brutally, violently torn apart by a sound that didn't belong, a desperate, fragile whimper, thin and reedy against the biting wind. It was a sound of raw human vulnerability, a stark, unwelcome intrusion into the carefully constructed fortress of his isolation. He found her by the treacherous, snow-dusted trail, a crumpled form against the stark white canvas of the wilderness. A young woman, impossibly fragile, bleeding and barely conscious, her breath shallow puffs of vapor in the biting cold. Her hair, dark and matted with snow, obscured a face that was pale and still, save for the faint tremor of her lips. Her presence was an immediate, visceral invasion, a violent disruption of the solitary existence he had meticulously cultivated. This unforgiving wilderness, personified not just by Lena's critical injuries, but by the encroaching, relentless blizzard, committed the first act of aggression. It forced Cole to confront a choice he believed he'd long buried, a decision that threatened to unravel the very fabric of his carefully chosen life. He felt the insidious pull of his past, the world he had fled with such deliberate conviction, threatening to drag him back into its chaotic maw. Every instinct screamed at him to leave her, to turn away and let the mountain claim its own, to preserve the sanctity of his solitude. Yet beneath the layers of his hardened resolve, a deeper, primal instinct ignited, overriding the calculated logic of self-preservation. It wasn't pity, not yet, but a cold, almost robotic assessment of the situation. He had to help her. His hands, calloused and strong, accustomed to the rough bite of ropes and the firm grip of reins, moved with an unexpected, almost tender precision. He carefully lifted her fragile form, a feather-light burden despite the blood and grime, onto Bluefire's broad, steady back. His loyal Mustang, a creature of the wild whose spirit mirrored his own, stood patiently, sensing the gravity of the moment, its breath pluming in the frigid air. The first consequence was immediate and undeniable, the brutal shattering of his routine, the disruption of the hard-won peace he had meticulously cultivated. As Bluefire began the slow, arduous trek back towards Cole's remote cabin, each hoof-fall a muffled thud against the deepening snow, a cold dread began to mingle with a spark of something utterly unfamiliar, a sensation he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Responsibility. It was a foreign weight, heavy and demanding, settling deep in his chest. A poetic justice, perhaps, for a man who had sought to sever all ties. Even the deepest solitude can be broken by the cry of humanity, and in that break, fate finds its hand. The silence that had once protected him now felt hollow, filled with the ragged breaths of the woman behind him and the ominous whispers of the gathering storm. The cabin's familiar warmth, usually a sanctuary of undisturbed quiet, now offered only a temporary, fragile reprieve. The flickering light from the stone hearth cast dancing shadows across Lena's still form as Cole gently laid her on his simple cot, her pale face stark against the rough wool blanket. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the mountain air, that this was merely the beginning. He had not just rescued a stranger, he had inadvertently brought the tumultuous outside world, with all its inherent dangers and confounding complexities, directly into the heart of his carefully guarded sanctuary. The blizzard howled outside with a primeval fury, rattling the cabin's sturdy logs, a perfect mirror to the churning turmoil brewing within him and the unseen, unknown threats Lena undoubtedly carried beneath her silent exterior. The storm raged, both outside and within, promising a reckoning. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The world Cole Maddox had built for himself in the silent, majestic Colorado mountains was a fortress of quiet solitude, meticulously crafted over years to keep the echoes of a painful past at bay. Here, far from the nearest flickering town lights, he lived a life stripped bare, reliant only on his own grit and the untamed spirit of Bluefire, his loyal Mustang. Bluefire, a wild, midnight blue stallion Cole had patiently tamed from the high ranges, was more than just a companion. His fiery independence and deep-seated caution mirrored Cole's own soul, a silent confidant in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. Their bond was one of mutual respect and understanding. forged in the crucible of shared solitude, a testament to a wildness that refused to be confined. Cole's remote cabin, a sturdy log structure he'd built with his own hands, clung to the mountainside like a stubborn limpet, a plume of smoke often curling lazily from its stone chimney against the backdrop of snow-capped peaks. His days unfolded with a timeless rhythm, dictated by the sun and the seasons. He rose before dawn, the air crisp and biting, to tend to blue fire, the scent of hay and horse, a comforting anchor in the vast quiet. Chores filled the hours, chopping wood, mending fences, checking traps he'd set for small game, always with an eye on the horizon, a hunter's instinct honed by necessity. He knew every game trail, every hidden spring, every whispering pine in his domain. The stark beauty of the landscape was his church, its harsh tranquility his only sermon. He found a profound, almost spiritual peace in the absence of human voices, the endless expanse of sky and rock a balm to his wounded spirit. Beneath the rugged exterior, the calloused hands, and the weathered face lay a profound loneliness he rarely acknowledged, even to himself. It was a loneliness that had driven him to this extreme isolation, a deep-seated desire for a peace untainted by the entanglements that had once caused him so much pain. His dream was simple, almost primitive: to remain undisturbed, to heal in the quiet vastness, to simply be, without expectation or judgment. He had fled a world that had betrayed him, a society that had broken his trust, and in these mountains he believed he had found his sanctuary, a place where the only promises were those of the changing seasons and the only betrayals were the sudden, unexpected blizzards. The true antagonist in Cole's story wasn't a person, but the insidious, corrosive force of his past. A series of events, betrayals, and injustices in the small towns nestled at the foot of these very mountains had driven him to seek this extreme isolation. He carried the scars of broken promises and the sting of accusations that had no basis in truth. This emotional background, a tapestry woven with threads of disillusionment and hurt, explained his deep-seated distrust of outsiders and his profound reluctance to engage with society. He had witnessed the darker side of human nature, the petty jealousies and the casual cruelties that could fester in close-knit communities, and he had chosen to remove himself entirely from their reach. The narrative hinted at a past where Cole had been deeply wounded, perhaps by a business deal gone sour, a false accusation that tarnished his good name, or the cold, indifferent shoulders of a community he had once considered his own. These were not singular, dramatic events, but a gradual erosion of his faith in humanity, a slow chipping away at his hope until only the bare rock of cynicism remained. This established his desperate need for solitude, his carefully guarded emotional walls, built brick by painful brick around a heart that had once been open and trusting. Lena's sudden, violent arrival, bleeding and helpless at his feet, was not merely an accident. It was a direct, undeniable challenge to the very foundation of his chosen existence, a crack appearing in the carefully constructed fortress of his solitude, threatening to expose the raw, vulnerable heart he had worked so hard to protect. The quiet hum of the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Lena's shallow breaths, brought a familiar, almost unwelcome clarity to Cole. Her presence, a stark reminder of the world he'd abandoned, began to chip away at the carefully constructed walls around his memories. The solitude he cherished, once a balm, now felt like a fragile shell, echoing with the ghosts of his past. It wasn't a single catastrophic event that had driven him to the desolate peaks, but a relentless accumulation of small, insidious betrayals, each one a tiny crack in his faith in humanity. He remembered the sting of Elias Thorne's smile, a man he had called a friend, a business partner in their small logging operation. Elias had always been charming, quick with a joke, and even quicker with a handshake. But when the opportunity arose, a lucrative contract that could have secured Cole's future, Elias had simply vanished with their shared capital, leaving Cole to face the creditors alone. The local sheriff, a man named Miller who now served in the valley below, had offered only shrugs and platitudes, suggesting Cole was naive to trust so easily. It wasn't just the financial ruin. It was the humiliation, the public whispers that followed him like a shadow, painting him as foolish, easily duped. The coldness from faces he'd once considered familiar, the averted gazes cut deeper than any financial loss. Then there was the incident with the livestock. A desperate winter had driven him to sell a portion of his herd, only for a few of the weaker calves to succumb to illness shortly after the sale. The buyer, a prominent rancher in the next county, had loudly accused Cole of selling him sick animals, spreading rumors of his dishonesty throughout the valley. Despite Cole's vehement denials and evidence of a sudden, virulent strain of pneumonia that had swept through the region, the accusation stuck. He saw the shift in people's eyes, the way conversations died when he approached, the subtle but undeniable ostracization. He became a pariah, not through any grand transgression, but through the slow, steady erosion of his reputation, built on half-truths and convenient scapegoating. He had tried to fight, to clear his name, to appeal to the sense of justice he believed still existed in the small community. But he quickly learned that local politics and social expectations were a tangled web, woven with threads of self-interest and convenience. He saw men he respected turn a blind eye, women he knew offer polite but empty condolences, their actions speaking louder than their carefully chosen words. He felt manipulated, a pawn in a larger game he couldn't comprehend, where truth was less important than maintaining appearances or protecting existing power structures. The profound injustice of it all had solidified his decision. He watched as the community embraced hypocrisy, celebrated self-interest, and turned its back on those who dared to question the established order. True peace, he concluded, could only be found far away from the fickle nature of human interaction in the immutable, honest vastness of the mountains. His flight to the mountains wasn't a sudden, impulsive act of despair. It was the inevitable culmination of years of emotional wear and tear, a slow, agonizing process of disillusionment. Each broken promise, each casual slight, each injustice had chipped away at his spirit until there was nothing left but a desperate need for silence, for the absence of human judgment. He had sought refuge, not from the world, but from the pain the world inflicted. The discovery of Lena, bleeding and broken at his feet, was not merely an accident of fate. It was a direct, visceral challenge to the very foundation of his chosen solitude, forcing him to confront the human connection he had so desperately tried to avoid, thrusting him back into the very entanglement he had fled with such determination. The past, it seemed, was not so easily outrun. As Lena's fragile hold on consciousness slowly strengthened, a different kind of tension began to permeate the quiet cabin. Her shallow breaths became more regular, her fever subsided, and the color gradually returned to her pale cheeks. Yet with each small sign of recovery, Cole felt an invisible cord tightening around him, pulling him further from the sanctuary he had so fiercely guarded. Her mere presence, though she mostly slept or lay in a quiet stupor, was a constant, palpable reminder of the outside world, of the human entanglements he had so desperately fled. The silence of the mountains, once his comforting cloak, now felt heavy, punctuated by the soft rustle of Lena shifting on the makeshift bed, a sound that echoed the disruption within his own soul. He watched her, a stranger whose life was now inextricably linked to his, and a cold dread seeped into his bones, far colder than any mountain wind. His infrequent, solitary trips to the distant general store, once simple necessities, now became fraught with a new, unsettling risk. The nearest small town, a collection of weathered buildings nestled in a valley bend, had always been a place for quick transactions and even quicker departures. But now he felt eyes on him, not overtly hostile, but curious, speculative. Whispers, like dry leaves skittering across dusty planks, seemed to follow him. A solitary cowboy, rarely seen, suddenly buying more provisions than usual, including items clearly meant for a woman, bandages, a softer blanket, even a small, almost forgotten tin of herbal tea. The mountain folk were observant, and news, however fragmented, traveled with surprising speed through the valleys. The local sheriff, a man named Brody with a long memory and a naturally suspicious nature, would often be found loitering near the store's pot-bellied stove. Sheriff Brody, a man whose easy smile never quite reached his sharp eyes, began to ask subtle, probing questions. "Heard you had a rough winter up there, Cole," he'd remark, his gaze lingering a moment too long on Cole's face. Or, "Everything quiet up your way? No strays? No unexpected visitors?" Initially, these seemed like benign inquiries, the casual chatter of a lawman in a quiet district. But as the weeks wore on and Cole's visits continued to betray a sustained, unusual need for supplies, Brody's posture grew more insistent, his questions laced with an undeniable edge. He represented the world Cole had tried to escape, The encroaching societal scrutiny, the potential legal ramifications of harboring an unknown, injured woman whose story remained untold. Brody's presence, his persistent curiosity, was a tangible manifestation of the past closing in, threatening to shatter the fragile peace Cole had built. Cole felt the suffocating weight of judgment from unseen eyes, the pressure of his past closing in with every passing day. His carefully constructed peace, the very foundation of his mountain life, was crumbling around him. He struggled internally with Lena's growing dependence, with the unspoken threat she represented to his hard-won freedom. Each day, as she regained a little more strength, a little more awareness, the walls he had meticulously built around his heart began to crack. He saw her vulnerability, her quiet gratitude, and a part of him, long dormant, stirred. But another part, the one scarred by betrayal and injustice, recoiled. He felt trapped, caught between a moral imperative to care for a helpless soul and an overwhelming urge to flee, to retreat further into the wilderness, to sever all ties. This was the peak of his internal and external conflict, a profound sense of emotional suffocation that pressed in from all sides, threatening to crush him before any major shift could even begin to take root. Days bled into weeks, and with each passing sunrise, Lena's frail form gathered a measure of strength. The fever broke, her breathing steadied, and the deep, angry gashes on her side began to knit, leaving behind stark, pink scars on her pale skin. Cole watched her, a silent sentinel, his initial fear slowly replaced by a profound, unsettling curiosity. Her eyes, once clouded with pain and delirium, now held a flicker of awareness, an intelligent, haunted depth that spoke volumes even before her voice returned. He found himself studying the subtle shifts in her expression, the way her hand would sometimes reach for the rough blanket, or how her gaze would linger on the flickering firelight, a hint of something fragile yet resilient beneath her trauma. The silence between them, once a comforting blanket for Cole, became heavy, pregnant with unspoken questions. He knew this fragile peace could not last. He felt it in the tightening knot in his gut, in the restless energy that pulsed beneath his skin. The external pressures of the encroaching town, the sheriff's subtle inquiries, now seemed distant, almost trivial compared to the storm brewing within the cabin itself. Lena, though still weak, was regaining her voice, and with it, the power to shatter his carefully constructed world. He saw the moments when words trembled on her lips, when a memory would flash across her eyes, causing her to flinch, to pull back into herself. He waited, dreading and anticipating the inevitable. Then came the turning point. One crisp morning, as Cole stirred the simmering stew over the hearth, Lena pushed herself up, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that pierced his long-held defenses. Her voice, still hoarse but clear, cut through the cabin's usual quiet, a devastating whisper that carried the weight of unspeakable terror. They weren't supposed to leave me alive. The words hung in the air, cold and sharp, severing the last threads of Cole's comfortable ignorance. He turned, his own breath catching, knowing in that instant that his life, his solitude, would never be the same. She began to speak, slowly at first, then with a rush of suppressed memory, a torrent of fear and desperation. It wasn't an accident that left her broken and bleeding on the mountain trail. She had witnessed something horrific, a brutal crime committed by a ruthless gang, men with no mercy, men who had seen her face. They had left her for dead, a convenient loose end, assuming the freezing wilderness would finish the job they had started. She recounted the flash of gunfire in the moonlit pines, the terrified scream of another victim, the chilling indifference in their eyes as they dragged her, broken, to the edge of the ravine. The details were visceral, painting a picture of calculated cruelty that settled like a cold stone in Cole's stomach. This wasn't some minor local dispute. This was a darkness that stretched far beyond the quiet valleys. Her revelation was devastating, not just for the sheer brutality of the crime, but for the immediate, undeniable danger it now posed to both of them. His cabin, once an impenetrable sanctuary, suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. He had brought the outside world in, yes, but not merely society's judgment. He had invited pure, unadulterated peril. His initial instinct, honed by years of self-preservation, screamed at him to protect his isolation, to somehow send her away, to sever this dangerous connection before it consumed him. He felt the familiar pull of the mountains, the urge to retreat further, to disappear into the vast, unforgiving landscape. But as he looked at Lena, at the raw vulnerability in her eyes, at the trembling courage that allowed her to speak these truths, a different, more powerful impulse took hold. It was a moral imperative, a spark of the man he once was, before disillusionment had hardened his heart. He could no longer remain a passive observer, a hermit hiding from the world's ugliness. To abandon her now would be to become complicit in the very injustice he had fled. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that helping her meant fully engaging with the world he had abandoned, facing its dangers head-on, stepping back into the fray he had so desperately sought to escape. The decision was monumental, a seismic shift in his carefully ordered existence, tearing down the emotional walls he had spent years constructing. Then, amidst the terror and the dawning realization of their predicament, an unexpected opportunity arose. Lena, her voice still a fragile thread, remembered a crucial detail, a hidden piece of evidence she had seen, a unique marking, a specific location, or perhaps a name whispered in the chaos. It was a detail so small, so seemingly insignificant, yet it held the potential to expose the criminals, to unravel their network, to bring their heinous acts into the light. This moment shattered the cycle of suffering and isolation that had defined both their lives. It transformed Cole from a reluctant rescuer into an active participant in a dangerous, undeniable quest for justice. The truth, once buried and hidden, now demanded action, and Cole, for the first time in years, felt a purpose beyond mere survival. The world Cole had so carefully constructed, a fortress of silence and self-reliance, crumbled in the wake of Lena's devastating revelation. The immediate consequence was a suffocating wave of fear, a primal dread that settled deep in his gut. His doubts, long buried under layers of mountain stoicism, clawed their way to the surface. He feared for Lena, a fragility he now felt bound to protect, and he feared for himself, for the quiet peace he had found and was on the verge of losing forever. The anxieties of his past, the betrayals and injustices that had driven him to this isolated existence, resurfaced with a vengeance, whispering insidious questions. Could he truly trust anyone again? Was he strong enough to face the darkness he had so desperately fled? A raw, guttural frustration welled within him, threatening to choke him. It wasn't anger at Lena, but a furious defiance against a fate that had dragged him back into the very entanglement he had sought to escape. One evening, staring into the flickering embers of his hearth, the weight of his commitment to Lena became an almost physical burden. He slammed his fist against the rough-hewn mantelpiece, a silent, desperate explosion of emotion. The sound echoed in the small cabin, a testament to the shattering of his carefully built emotional walls. In that moment of raw vulnerability, he accepted it. He was in this, fully and irrevocably. His reawakened humanity, once a distant, uncomfortable memory, now burned with an undeniable, fierce resolve. He would protect her, no matter the cost. Their new reality demanded action, but also discretion. Cole knew he couldn't face this alone. His mind drifted to Silas, a retired forest ranger who lived a few valleys over, an old acquaintance known for his quiet wisdom and unwavering integrity. Silas had always been an outsider, respected but never fully integrated into the valley's intricate social dance. He was a man who saw things clearly, without the haze of local gossip or self-interest. Cole's journey to Silas's cabin was fraught with a new kind of tension, every shadow a potential threat. Silas, a man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much, listened patiently as Cole recounted Lena's story, his gaze unwavering. He didn't offer platitudes. Instead, he offered crucial information. Rumors of a new, ruthless outfit operating in the territory, their methods brutal, their reach surprisingly wide. Silas also knew the subtle currents of the local communities, identifying potential allies and, more importantly, those who might unwittingly or willingly serve as obstacles. Back in the nearest small town, the air had shifted. The casual curiosity about Cole had sharpened into something colder, more suspicious. Some townspeople, their faces familiar from his past life, now avoided his gaze, their whispers following him like a chill wind. The owner of the general store, a portly man named Jed, who usually greeted Cole with a grumble and a nod, now offered only curt responses, his eyes darting uneasily. Cole recognized the signs, the fear of getting involved, the deep-seated self-preservation that often trumped justice in these isolated communities. There were those, perhaps linked to the gang Lena spoke of, or simply wary of outsiders disrupting their fragile peace, who saw Cole and Lena as a dangerous liability. The rugged, independent culture of the mountain folk, while valuing loyalty, also held a strong current of looking after one's own, and Cole, by bringing Lena into their midst, had become an anomaly, a breach in their unwritten rules. Yet amidst the growing suspicion, there were faint glimmers of something else. A few, like Silas, understood the silent code of the mountains, where a person in need was never truly abandoned. These individuals, few and far between, represented the enduring spirit of justice and camaraderie that still flickered in the harsh landscape. The psychological impact on Cole was profound. He was forced to confront the very failures and fears that had driven him to isolation. Each day, he felt the old wounds ache, but with them came an unexpected surge of strength, born from his renewed purpose. Protecting Lena wasn't just a burden, it was a crucible, forging a new Cole, one who could face the world not with cynical detachment, but with a fierce, protective love. Lena, too, grappled with the lingering trauma of her ordeal, but the hope Cole offered, the unwavering strength in his presence, began to mend the raw edges of her fear. A silent, unbreakable bond formed between them, a fragile alliance against a dangerous world, with Bluefire, the loyal Mustang, a steadfast witness to their shared journey. They were no longer just rescuer and rescued. They were two souls bound by a desperate fight for survival and a nascent, powerful trust. The crisp mountain air, once a comfort in its silence, now carried the faint scent of change, of an approaching storm that was both literal and metaphorical. Cole, no longer a man defined solely by his retreat, stood at a crossroads, Bluefire a steady presence beside him. Lena, her spirit rekindled by his unwavering support and the promise of justice, had found her voice, a clear, resonant testament to the horrors she had endured. Together, armed with Silas's intelligence and Lena's unshakable resolve, they prepared to confront the darkness that had spilled from the valleys into their sanctuary. The old ranger Silas, a man whose quiet wisdom had weathered countless seasons, had confirmed the grim rumors of the gang's ruthless operation, their illicit activities intertwined with a subtle, pervasive thread of local corruption that had, for too long, allowed them to operate with impunity. The confrontation was not a sudden explosion of violence, but a calculated, deliberate unraveling. Cole, guided by Lena's vivid recollections and Silas's understanding of the territory, led them to the gang's hidden lair, a desolate, forgotten cabin tucked deep within a less-traveled canyon. The cultivated element of surprise became their greatest weapon. With the quiet efficiency born of years in the wilderness, Cole orchestrated their approach, using every element of the terrain to their advantage. Lena, though still bearing the scars of her ordeal, stood firm, her testimony a powerful, unassailable truth that cut through the gang's bravado and fear. The local sheriff, initially swayed by the gang's influence or simply unwilling to stir the hornet's nest, found himself with undeniable evidence, presented by Silas and Cole's quiet authority, forcing his hand. The truth, once a whispered fear, was now a roaring current, sweeping away the carefully constructed facade of power and intimidation. The gang, caught off guard, their illicit operations exposed, crumbled under the weight of the evidence and the sudden, unified front of justice. Their downfall was swift, less a dramatic shootout and more a methodical dismantling of their network, a direct consequence of their own hubris and Lena's courage. The insidious elements of the past, the local figures who had turned a blind eye, offered assistance, or profited from the gang's presence, were also brought to light. Their complicity, once hidden beneath layers of local loyalty and fear, was now exposed for all to see. It was a hard-won triumph, not without its costs, but a victory nonetheless against overwhelming odds, a testament to what two individuals could achieve. The mountains, which had once cradled Cole in his solitude, now bore witness to his re-engagement with the world, a world he had once fled but now, for Lena, had dared to face. With the immediate danger quelled and justice beginning its slow, deliberate march, Cole finally found a realistic emotional closure, a deep-seated peace. His isolation wasn't entirely abandoned. The mountains would always be his home, his sanctuary. But it was transformed. The walls he had built around his heart, once impenetrable, now had gates, opened by the cry of a stranger and the profound connection that followed. He had learned, through shared danger, that true strength lay not in avoiding connection, but in embracing it, in daring to feel and care. The old wounds from his past, the betrayals and injustices, were not erased, but they were healed in a new, profound way, overlaid with the quiet satisfaction of having done right, of having cared for another. Lena, now safe and free from the grip of fear, chose her own path. She spoke of returning to the world, perhaps to pursue further justice, or simply to rebuild a life. Her gratitude to Cole was immense, a silent understanding passing between them, an indelible mark of his kindness forever etched upon her spirit. She carried with her not just the memory of trauma, but the quiet strength of survival and the unexpected gift of human connection found in desolate places. Cole stood with Bluefire on a familiar mountain ridge, the vast expanse of the Colorado wilderness stretching before them. The setting sun painted the peaks in hues of gold and crimson, a spectacle of raw beauty. But the view was no longer one of pure solitude, of a man deliberately apart. It was now deeply imbued with the memory of Lena, the echoes of their shared struggle, and the quiet understanding that his world, once small and contained, had expanded to include the vastness of human connection. The crisp wind whispered through the pines, carrying a new kind of peace. Not the peace of emptiness, but the peace of a heart reawakened to its capacity for purpose. Sometimes the deepest solitude isn't broken by a choice.